you for joining us this morning on this webinar on user security. As usual, if you have any questions at any point, you can just put them into your questions panel and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
Welcome to the day's tutorial. Let's get started. Let's have a look at our agenda for today. Today we're looking at OCS User Security. So first we'll look at what we mean by user security, and then we'll talk about local user access versus WebMI user access. Then we'll talk about setting access levels on individual objects. We'll also talk about the method you use to input user credentials into your project so that users or operators can use those credentials to log into your machine. We'll talk about runtime operation and what kind of status feedback you get based on which operators are logged in. We'll have demonstrations throughout, and as always we'll finish with the Q&A session. So first we'll look at what we mean by user security. Cscape offers multiple features that are related to security. First we have project security. That's the feature where you can protect your intellectual property by preventing unauthorized access to your Cscape program. Today we'll be looking at user security, which is the ability to restrict user access to certain screens and certain objects at runtime. Those user access levels are granted based on the login credentials that you assign to users. User security can be applied in two different ways. First of all, you can think about user security in relation to the local operator interface, where the operator logs into the local OCS using a user access object. You can also talk about user security in relation to WebMI, which allows you to remotely monitor and potentially control your OCS from a web browser. The XL series and XL Prime can support user security for both local operator access from the touchscreen as well as remote WebMI access, while our products like the XLE, XLT and the Micro OCS families only support WebMI based user security. So how does the OCS control user access? You may be used to HMIs that use a page level or screen level access model for user security. The only problem with that is you could end up having to create many almost identical screens that have different levels of security. With the OCS, we have an object level access approach instead, where every object that has an action can be assigned an elevated security or access level, which limits which operators are able to operate an object. So what is an object that has an action? So that could be a push button, for example, where you push the button to start or stop something. Or it could be a screen jump object where you push the button to change to a certain screen. Another example would be an editable numeric data field, where you push that object to change the value of a key process set point, for example. In order for an operator to actually operate any of these objects which has an elevated access level, their own access level that has been assigned has to at least meet the access level of that object. If it does, it will operate as normal, and if not, they'll be restricted from accessing it. So how do you set the access level on individual objects in Cscape? Since we're talking about graphical objects, we'll be working in the graphics editor. For every individual graphics object that you put on the screen, if it has an action to it, you'll have the ability to set an elevated access level. For most objects, the access to all operators is likely going to be the same. But for certain key set points, especially certain screen jumps that you want to limit from an operator standpoint, you're likely going to have to elevate the access level. After you've placed that object on the screen, you double click on it to pull up the configuration dialog, and if that object has an action, you'll see the access button is available. You then press the access button, and in the pop-up window you can set the access level between 0 and 7, with 0 being no restrictions at all, up to a level 7, which is the most restricted. If you want to replicate a screen level access model, you can do that simply by increasing or elevating the access level of a jump button, and in order to use that jump button to navigate to that screen that you want to protect, you have to meet the set access level. Now let's look at what happens at runtime. So as I mentioned before, when an operator presses an object with an action, one of two things is going to happen. First of all, if their access level is equal or greater than the access level set for the object, then it will operate as normal. However, if their access level is too low, then when they press that object, they'll see access denied. If it's an editable numeric object, they'll still see the current value of that object, but they won't have the access level to be able to change that value. Next, let's talk about user credentials. So how do we assign the user an access level in Cscape? So again, from the graphics editor, this time you go to the config menu and select the option for user security configuration. Then I have a dialog that appears that allows us to configure up to 255 sets of user credentials. Every user credential consists of a username, which is an alphanumeric field up to 16 characters long, and a password, which is an alphanumeric field up to 10 characters long. Alphanumeric means it can be numbers and letters, but not brackets, exclamation points, or other symbols. Generally, I would recommend that you hard code in these user credentials. You could also assign variables to those credentials. WebMI requires constants to be entered in, however, and you don't have the ability to use variables for your user credentials. Keep in mind you can enter up to 255 sets of credentials. So when you decide to add credentials or when editing existing ones, it's just a matter of pressing the appropriate button for edit or add, etc. If you're using a variable for username or password, you just select browse and then select the relevant variable. I recommend hard coding the username and password in between the single quotes. In this original dialog for adding the credentials, you'll see that there is a default set of credentials called default user with a password of default. I typically leave this one in and then add additional ones to it. Then with each set of credentials, you set the access level that that particular set of credentials has. The last step we need to do is when we need to give the operator some way of logging in at runtime. We do that by adding a system login object, such as a password object. You can see that highlighted in the image on the right. Once you press that icon, you drop a password object on the screen and then you double click on it to go into the configuration dialog. At the very bottom, you'll notice that there is a pull down list that allows you to select an object type, and for that you select user access as the object type. By doing this, now your password object becomes a user login object. Then you can change the font sizes, edit the legend, resize the object, etc. Once you've done that, the last thing you have to do with the system login object is assign it a double integer variable. That double integer will be set to 0 and doesn't do anything, however there always must be a variable assigned with the password object. So after that, the last thing we may want to configure is back where we added our user credentials, which is our status variable. If we're not using WebMI, we can assign a status variable that in the end is going to be 10 words long. The first 2 words will tell us in seconds how long the current user has been logged in for, and the next 8 words will tell us in ASCII what that username is. If I prepare the project for WebMI, we'll select the WebMI support checkbox, and then our status goes from 10 words up to 50 words, where as well as the local user information, we also have 4 sets of concurrent WebMI logins that we can monitor as well. That's because with WebMI you could have multiple people logging in simultaneously in addition to the operator. Now let's begin our demo where I'll demonstrate how to set up that user functionality. So I'll open Cscape and I'll open the graphics editor. Almost all we'll do with user security is done from the graphics editor. So here is a home screen that I've created. So let's look at some of the different techniques you can use with user security. First, let's start with this group of 3 jump objects. These are what the operator will typically use to change screens. So I've created a jump object to go to a screen to allow the user to log in. Typically, you don't need to elevate the access level of a lot of your objects, but only the key ones. So in the case of this jump button, it has an access level, and by pressing it you'll see I've left the access level at its lowest or at 0, because I want everybody who presses that button to have the opportunity to either log in or log out of the machine. With the machine setup jump button on the other hand, as you can imagine, you don't want everybody to have access to the machine setup screen. So in this case, when I select access for this jump button, I've decided to elevate the access level above 0 up to 4, which is about halfway. Remember, the access levels go from 0 to 7. There's no one right answer, so you need to design the different access levels for whatever you're trying to achieve. So any operator with access level of 4 or higher will be able to access the machine setup screen. In the middle here is the machine status screen. This will show you what's going on with this machine, such as if it's running or not, what the processes look like, etc. There's no harm in allowing any operator to see that information, though I may not want them to change anything critical if they don't know what they're doing, but allowing them just to see that information on that screen is perfectly fine in this case. So I've decided not to protect or elevate the access level above 0 for this jump object. So what does the machine status screen look like? I'll use my simulator pointer and switch to that screen. I have a number of objects on this demo screen, including bar graphs, analog meters, and a pilot light that don't have an action at runtime, and when I press these objects, nothing happens. They're just there to provide feedback and they don't have an action. However, I do have this numeric data object, which is editable, as well as a start process toggle switch. For these, I elevated the access level because I don't want an operator with a lower level of access to be able to use them. So under my start process toggle switch, I'll set the access level to 3. For the key processes set point, I set that access level to 4. So on my single screen, by changing the access level on different key objects on the screen, I can have different things available to different operators after they log in. Next, let's take a look at entering in user credentials. So staying in the graphics editor, we'll go to the config menu, and under user security configuration, here I've entered in a small number of user credentials. I have 4 user credentials as well as the default one. Editing them is very simple. You either hit the add button or the edit button, and you can type in the username and password, which are alphanumeric fields, and you can also input the access level. Again, I recommend you hard code those in, and therefore you need to put them in between these single quotes. And again, they're alphanumeric strings. I also chose to use the status feedback and take advantage of WebMI. So I have a user status variable which contains information I can monitor for the users currently logged in, as well as how long they've been logged in for, and then I've also decided to support WebMI. I also increased the user timeout from 5 minutes, which is the default, up to 15 minutes. This is the time in which the OCS will automatically log out an operator after they've logged in. So that's how you configure the user credentials. Next, I'll show you this user status screen that I created here. For this, I just put in data fields that show you what you'll actually see when you look at the status information for the user. So you'll see the username as well as how long they've been logged in for in seconds. You'll see that for both the local user as well as up to 4 concurrent WebMI users. Now let's look at all that running on the OCS. So here's the home screen. First, I'll go into the user login screen. You'll notice from looking at this object that currently there is no user logged in. So I'll log in and I'll input novice for my username. That user has a low access level. Then I'll input my password, and keep in mind the password field is case sensitive, so I need to enter it properly. Then I'll hit enter, and if I've done that correctly after pressing login, I see the username is now novice. Now I'll go back to our home screen. If I try to go into machine setup, that's not going to work because with this user I don't have an access level high enough to be able to access that screen. Instead, I'll try the machine status and I can access this one. I can see everything that's going on in my machine here. I can watch the process change, I can see that the system's running, etc. So I can see all the information on this screen, but if I try and stop the process by toggling this switch, that's not going to work. As well as that, if I try to change this set point, that's not going to work either, as I don't have a high enough access level with this user to be able to operate those objects. Next, let's look at my user status screen. Here we can see that I have a logged in OCS user locally which is named Novice, and I've been logged in for about 65 seconds. Next, I'll show you what happens when I log in remotely using WebMI. For that, I'll go back to my PC and I'll open my web browser. Here I'm using Chrome. So I'll navigate to the IP address of this OCS, and then it's going to ask me for a username and password. And for this, I didn't have to configure anything here. That's just built in when you go to access WebMI. I'll log in this time with a username and password with a high access level from the set of credentials that were programmed in. So setup is the username, and then I'll input the password. Once I accept the license agreement and hit continue, I have the same view that an operator would have, and I'm looking at the initial screen. Now I'll open a window that shows what's happening on the OCS screen directly. So you can see I'm looking at a different screen remotely than what my operator is looking at, because I have set up WebMI not to synchronize with the exact same display of what's going on the local screen, but to have the ability to look at things independently. On the local screen, I'll go back to the machine status screen so you can see what's happening on the machine. Then from my WebMI, I'll go to my machine setup. I have a high enough access level so I can navigate to that screen. Let's go back to our home page and go to the machine status. I'm looking at the same information that my operator is currently looking at, but since this WebMI user has a high enough access level, I have the ability to change this process setpoint. I could also toggle off the process. And then the local user on the OCS can see the results of what's being changed remotely. Now on my WebMI, I'll pull up that status screen again, and this time you'll see that there's two users logged in. We have the novice who's been logged in for around 260 seconds, and we have my WebMI user number 1 or setup, which has been logged in for around 130 seconds. Next, I'm going to close my browser and bring up the OCS in full screen. Going back to the status screen, here you'll see that the setup WebMI user is still logged in. That's because I've set a timeout of 20 seconds for WebMI, meaning that 20 seconds after I close the browser, the OCS is going to automatically log off that WebMI user, and you can see that's exactly what happened here. That concludes our demonstration for today. Thank you for joining me for today's tutorial, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, nice and straightforward again this morning. I shall take you back to my screen. So just back to the webinar page on the website, you can see the upcoming webinars, and all the registration links are there for those as well if you'd like to register for them now and save yourself the time. On that note, I think we've covered everything today. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week.